When a homeless man gives his only coat to a shivering stranger, he has no idea she's a billionaire CEO about to change his life forever. What happens next will restore your faith in humanity and prove that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles. This is a story that will make you believe in second chances, true love, and the power of a generous heart. Stay with me until the end to see how one winter night transformed two broken souls into something beautiful. And please comment what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled across the world. The December wind cut through Manhattan like a blade carrying with it the promise of snow and the bitter reality of another merciless winter night. Steam rose from manholes like ghostly fingers reaching toward a starless sky, while the city's heartless rhythm pounded on cars, honking sirens, wailing millions of people rushing past each other without so much as a glance. But at the corner of 42nd and Lexington, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Daniel Hayes pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his shoulders, the fabric so worn that the cold seeped through it like water through a sieve. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to coax some warmth into his numb toes. The bus stop's plastic shelter provided little protection from the wind that seemed determined to strip away what little dignity he had left. 3 years ago, Daniel had been a different man entirely. An environmental engineer with a corner office, a beautiful wife named Sarah, and a 7-year-old son whose laughter could light up the darkest room. He'd worn tailored suits and driven a BMW, lived in a house with a white picket fence in Westchester County. He'd been the kind of man who gave to charity at Christmas and felt good about himself for it, never imagining he'd one day be on the receiving end of such kindness. But life has a way of humbling even the most successful among us. Sarah's cancer had arrived like a thief in the night, stealing first her strength, then their savings, and finally her life. The medical bills had consumed everything: the house, the car, the college fund they'd been building for their son Noah. And when the insurance company found a way to deny coverage for the experimental treatments that might have saved her, Daniel had made a choice that would haunt him forever. He'd taken money that wasn't his funds from an environmental cleanup project, telling himself it was just a loan that he'd pay it back once Sarah was better. But Sarah never got better. And when the embezzlement was discovered 6 months after her funeral, Daniel's world collapsed completely. He lost his job, his professional license, his reputation. Worse still, he lost Noah. Child Services had deemed him an unfit parent, a convicted felon with no income and no home, and placed his son with Sarah's sister in California. Now, 18 months later, Daniel was a ghost haunting the streets of the city he'd once called home. He lived in his rusted pickup truck when the weather was kind, in shelters when it wasn't, and sometimes on nights like this, when even the shelters were full, he simply endured. The digital display at the bus stop flickered 11:47 p.m. The last bus of the night wouldn't arrive for another 23 minutes, and Daniel wasn't even sure he had the fare. He'd spent his last $7 on a sandwich earlier that day, choosing food over transportation in the endless calculus of survival that had become his life. He was contemplating the long walk to the shelter on the Lower East Side when he heard the soft click of heels against concrete. A woman emerged from the shadows between buildings, her silhouette sharp against the amber glow of streetlights. Even from a distance, Daniel could see that she belonged to a different world than his. Her coat was wool and perfectly tailored, her purse leather and expensive, her posture that of someone accustomed to being in control. As she drew closer, stepping into the circle of light cast by the bus stop's overhead lamp, Daniel found himself studying her with the kind of attention that came from having nothing but time to observe the world around him. She was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, and skin that spoke of spa treatments and careful protection from the sun. Her features were striking high cheekbones, expressive eyes, and a mouth that seemed designed for boardroom negotiations rather than smiles. But what caught Daniel's attention wasn't her obvious wealth or beauty. It was the way she was shivering. The woman's coat, for all its expensive tailoring, was clearly designed more for style than substance. It was a spring-weight wool appropriate for a crisp October evening, but woefully inadequate for the December freeze that had gripped the city for the past week. Her hands, manicured and pale, were clasped tightly together, and Daniel could see her breath coming in quick puffs as she tried to generate warmth through movement. She pulled out her phone, and Daniel caught a glimpse of the screen, no signal. She turned in a slow circle, holding the device up toward the sky like an offering to the gods of cellular coverage, but the gesture was futile. This part of the city had always been a dead zone after midnight, something about the old buildings interfering with the towers. "Come on," she muttered, her voice carrying a slight tremor that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with frustration. "Come on, please." Daniel watched as she scrolled through her contacts, presumably looking for someone to call once she found a signal. But even from where he stood, he could see the truth that she was only beginning to understand at nearly midnight on a Tuesday in December. There was no one coming to rescue her. The woman glanced around the empty street, and for the first time Daniel saw something he recognized in her eyes, the look of someone who was utterly, completely alone. She approached the bus stop with careful steps, her heels clicking against the concrete in a rhythm that spoke of expensive shoes and careful breeding. As she drew closer, Daniel got a better look at her face and realized she was even more beautiful than he'd initially thought. But it was a cold beauty, the kind that suggested she wasn't used to being vulnerable. "Excuse me," she said, her voice professionally polite, but carrying an undertone of desperation. "Do you know when the next bus comes?" Her accent was educated neutral American, with just a hint of something else, maybe East Coast prep school, or perhaps the careful diction of someone who'd worked hard to erase their origins. She kept her distance from him, and Daniel couldn't blame her. He knew what he looked like, unshaven, unwashed, wearing clothes that had seen too many nights on the street. 20 minutes. Daniel replied quietly, not wanting to startle her with sudden movement or loud speech. "Maybe longer. They don't keep the best schedule this time of night." She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to generate warmth. Her lips were starting to take on a bluish tinge, and Daniel could see that she was fighting to keep her teeth from chattering. "Are you all right?" he asked, though the question felt absurd. Clearly she wasn't all right. Clearly neither of them was all right, but in very different ways. "Fine," she said automatically, the response of someone who'd been trained never to show weakness. "Just waiting for a ride." Daniel didn't call her on the obvious lie. Instead, he studied her face in the harsh fluorescent light of the bus stop. There was something about her expression, a vulnerability beneath the polished exterior, that reminded him painfully of Sarah in her final days when she'd still been trying to pretend that everything was going to be okay. The wind picked up, and the woman's shivering became more pronounced. She pulled her coat tighter, but it was a losing battle against the elements. Daniel could see her breath coming faster now, and he realized with growing concern that she might be in real danger. Hypothermia was a silent killer, and he'd seen too many people on the streets underestimate its threat. For a moment he hesitated. His jacket was all he had, his only protection against the cold, his last barrier between himself and the elements. If he gave it to her, he'd be risking his own health, maybe even his life. The rational part of his mind, the part that had been hardened by months of survival on the streets, told him to look away, to mind his own business, to protect himself first. But then she looked up at him, and Daniel saw something in her eyes that broke his heart. She was trying so hard to be strong, to maintain the facade of control that had probably served her well in whatever world she came from. But underneath it all, she was just a person in need, alone and cold and scared. And in that moment, Daniel remembered who he used to be. Not the successful engineer with the corner office, but the man who'd fallen in love with Sarah because she'd cried during a commercial about rescue dogs. The father who'd read bedtime stories to Noah every night, even when he was exhausted from work. The person who'd always believed that doing the right thing mattered more than doing the easy thing. "Here," Daniel said, and before he could change his mind, he was shrugging out of his jacket. The woman looked up in surprise as he held the worn fabric out to her. "What are you doing?" "You're freezing," Daniel said simply. "This will help." She stared at the jacket, as if it were a foreign object. "I can't. I mean, you need it." "I've got a sweater," Daniel lied, gesturing to the thin cotton t-shirt that was his only other layer. "And I'm used to the cold. You're not." The woman looked from the jacket to Daniel's face, and he saw the exact moment when her carefully constructed walls began to crack. Her eyes, which had been guarded and distant, suddenly filled with something that looked like recognition, not of him, but of the gesture itself. "I don't understand," she said softly. "Why would you?" "Because you need it more than I do," Daniel replied, still holding out the jacket. "And because—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Because sometimes we help each other. That's what people do." For a long moment, they stood there in the cold, two strangers separated by circumstances, but connected by the most fundamental human need, the need for kindness in a world that often seemed to have forgotten what it meant. Finally, with trembling fingers, she reached out and took the jacket. The moment the wool left Daniel's hands, the cold hit him like a physical blow. The wind cut through his t-shirt as if it were tissue paper, and he had to clench his jaw to keep his teeth from chattering. But watching the woman wrap his jacket around her shoulders, seeing the immediate relief on her face as the warmth enveloped her, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of having done something right. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice was different now, softer, more human. "I'm Elena." "Daniel," he replied, shoving his hands deep into his pockets to hide their trembling. Elena looked down at the jacket, running her fingers over the worn fabric. It was a good jacket, or had been once. Daniel had bought it 5 years ago for a fishing trip with Noah, back when such luxuries were possible. It was a dark green canvas with a wool lining, practical and warm, though now faded and frayed at the edges. "This is a really nice jacket," Elena said, and there was something in her voice that Daniel couldn't quite identify. "It's been well loved." Daniel nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The jacket held too many memories, Noah wearing it, when it was still too big for him, Sarah borrowing it for her morning walks before she got sick, the countless nights it had kept Daniel warm since he'd lost everything else. "I'll make sure you get it back," Elena said, and Daniel could hear the sincerity in her voice. "I promise." Before Daniel could respond, headlights swept across them as a black town car pulled up to the curb. Elena looked up in surprise, then pulled out her phone. Apparently, she'd finally gotten a signal. The driver, a middle-aged man in a dark suit, got out and opened the rear door. "Ms. Carter, I apologize for the delay. There was an accident on the FDR and—" "It's fine, Marcus," Elena said, but her voice had already begun to change, returning to the crisp, professional tone Daniel had first heard. The vulnerability was sliding away like makeup being washed off, revealing the polished executive underneath. She turned to Daniel, and for a moment he saw her struggle with something, duty perhaps, or protocol. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "Elena Carter," she said, pressing the card into his hand. Carter Industries. If you ever need anything. Daniel looked down at the card. Even in the dim light, he could see the embossed logo, the quality of the cardstock. Carter Industries, he recognized the name. It was one of the largest development companies in the city, worth billions. He looked up at Elena with new eyes, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't just a wealthy woman who'd been caught in the cold. This was Elena Carter, the Elena Carter, the woman who'd been featured on magazine covers and business news programs, the youngest CEO to ever make the Fortune 500. And he'd just given his jacket to one of the most powerful people in New York City. Daniel began, but Elena was already moving toward the car. "Keep the card," she said over her shoulder. "Please." She paused at the car door, turning back to look at him one more time. In that moment, with his jacket wrapped around her shoulders and her carefully styled hair beginning to come loose in the wind, she looked almost human again. "Thank you, Daniel," she said. And this time, when she spoke his name, it sounded like a promise. Then she was gone, disappearing into the warm interior of the town car. The vehicle pulled away from the curb with a soft purr of expensive engineering, leaving Daniel alone at the bus stop with nothing but a business card and the rapidly growing realization of what he'd just done. The cold hit him full force now, and he began to shiver in earnest. His t-shirt provided virtually no protection against the wind, and he could already feel his core temperature beginning to drop. The bus was still 15 minutes away, and Daniel wasn't sure he could last that long. But as he looked down at the business card in his hand, feeling the expensive weight of the paper between his fingers, he found himself thinking, not about the cold, but about the moment when Elena's walls had come down. There had been something in her eyes, something that suggested she understood what it meant to be alone in the world. A few snowflakes began to fall, dancing in the amber glow of the streetlights. Daniel pulled his arms tight against his chest and settled in to wait, the business card safely tucked in his pocket, next to the crumpled photo of Noah that he carried everywhere. He had no way of knowing that 20 blocks away, Elena Carter was sitting in the back of her town car, running her fingers over the worn fabric of his jacket and fighting back tears for the first time in years. He couldn't know that tucked into the inside pocket of that jacket was a child's drawing, a crayon picture of a man and a boy fishing together with "I love you, Daddy," written in Noah's careful 7-year-old handwriting. And he certainly couldn't know that this chance encounter, this simple act of kindness between strangers, was about to change both of their lives in ways neither could imagine. The snow continued to fall as Daniel waited for the bus, each flake catching the light like tiny stars. In his pocket, Elena Carter's business card grew warm from the heat of his hand, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something extraordinary. But for now, he was just a man without a coat, waiting for a bus that might never come, holding on to hope by the thinnest of threads. And in a penthouse apartment across town, a woman who had everything was discovering that sometimes the most valuable gifts come from those who have nothing left to give. The city continued its relentless pace around them, millions of people going about their lives, unaware that in a single moment of kindness, 2 hearts had begun to heal from wounds they'd thought would never mend. The elevator climbed silently toward the 42nd floor, its polished steel walls reflecting Elena's pale face back at her in fractured images. She clutched Daniel's jacket tighter around her shoulders, breathing in the scent that clung to the worn fabric, a mixture of honest work, winter air, and something indefinably masculine that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. Marcus had tried to make conversation during the ride uptown, commenting on the weather and tomorrow's early meetings, but Elena had remained silent, staring out at the city lights blurring past the window. Now alone in the elevator that would carry her back to her carefully ordered world, she found herself reluctant to let go of the strange warmth that had settled around her heart. The doors opened with a soft chime revealing the marble foyer of her penthouse. Elena stepped out, her heels clicking against the cold stone, the sound echoing in the vast space. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The minimalist furniture arranged with geometric precision. The abstract paintings hung at perfect intervals. The floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Central Park, shrouded in winter darkness. It was beautiful. It was expensive. It was everything she'd worked for. And it felt emptier than ever. Elena moved through the space like a ghost. Daniel's jacket still wrapped around her shoulders like armor against the sterile perfection of her home. She poured herself a glass of wine from a bottle that cost more than most people made in a week, but the liquid tasted like ash in her mouth. 20 blocks away, Daniel had finally caught the last bus of the night, his body shaking so violently from the cold that the driver had taken pity on him and waived the fare. Now he sat in the back, his arms wrapped around his chest, trying to generate warmth through friction and willpower alone. The other passengers, a few late-shift workers and night owls heading home, studiously avoided looking at him, their discomfort palpable in the recycled air. Daniel understood their reaction. He'd been one of them once, the kind of person who crossed the street to avoid the homeless, who rationalized his indifference with assumptions about addiction and personal responsibility. It was easier to believe that people chose their circumstances than to confront the terrifying randomness of fate. The bus lurched to a stop at 14th Street, and Daniel climbed off into the night. The shelter was still 6 blocks away, and he wasn't sure his legs would carry him that far. The adrenaline from his encounter with Elena had worn off, leaving him hollow and shaking. He thought about the business card in his pocket, about the look in her eyes when she'd taken his jacket, and wondered if he'd imagined the moment of connection between them. Elena Carter. He'd read about her in newspapers and magazines back when he could afford such luxuries. The brilliant young CEO who'd transformed her father's struggling real estate company into a multi-billion-dollar empire. The woman who'd been photographed at charity galas and society functions, always immaculately dressed, always alone. Now, as Elena stood in her pristine living room, she was thinking about those same photographs, remembering how carefully her publicist had crafted her image. The powerful executive who needed no one, who'd built her success on steel determination and ruthless efficiency. It was a persona that had served her well in the boardroom, but tonight it felt like a costume she could no longer bear to wear. She moved toward her bedroom, intending to hang Daniel's jacket in her closet until she could figure out how to return it. But as she reached for the garment, her fingers brushed against something in the inside pocket, something that crinkled like paper. Elena hesitated. She'd been raised with impeccable manners, taught that going through someone's belongings was the height of impropriety. But curiosity won out over propriety, and she carefully extracted a folded piece of paper from the jacket's depths. It was a child's drawing, executed in crayon on construction paper, that had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases were beginning to tear. The artwork itself was simple: a stick figure, man, with dark hair, standing next to a smaller figure with a fishing pole. Between them, a blue squiggle suggested water, while overhead, a yellow circle served as the sun. But it was the words written in a child's careful hand that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. "I love you, Daddy, Noah." Elena sank onto the edge of her bed, the drawing trembling in her hands. Daniel was a father. This worn jacket, the one he'd given her without hesitation, carried with it the love of a child who missed his daddy enough to put it down on paper with crayons and construction paper, and all the fierce devotion that only a 7-year-old could muster. She studied the drawing more closely, noting the details that spoke of a child's intimate knowledge of his father's world. The man in the picture wore what looked like the same green jacket that now surrounded Elena's shoulders. The fishing pole was carefully rendered complete with a tiny hook and line. And in the corner, almost lost among the blue crayon waves, was a small heart with Noah plus Daddy written inside. Elena's eyes filled with tears, the first she'd shed in years. She tried to remember the last time she'd cried, but the memory was lost in the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart. Crying was weakness her foster parents had taught her. Crying was self-indulgence that poor children couldn't afford. But tonight, alone in her penthouse with a stranger's jacket wrapped around her shoulders and his child's love letter in her hands, Elena finally let the tears fall. Meanwhile, Daniel had reached the shelter, only to find that the last bed had been taken 10 minutes earlier. The volunteer at the desk, a kind woman in her 60s, offered him coffee and a blanket, but the warming center was already at capacity. "I'm sorry, honey," she said, her voice full of genuine regret. "But there's supposed to be a break in the weather tomorrow. Maybe try the place on Houston Street. They sometimes have overflow space." Daniel nodded, accepting the coffee with hands that shook from more than just the cold. The Houston Street shelter was another mile away, and he wasn't sure he had the strength for the walk. He found himself thinking about Elena Carter's warm car, about the way she'd looked at him before she drove away. He pulled her business card from his pocket, studying the elegant script and embossed logo. Carter Industries. Elena Carter, Chief Executive Officer. An address on Fifth Avenue that put her office in one of the most expensive buildings in Manhattan. What would she think if she could see him now, Daniel wondered, sitting in a homeless shelter's lobby, clutching a cup of weak coffee and trying to work up the courage for another cold night on the streets. Would she remember the man who'd given her his jacket? Or would she see only what everyone else saw? A failure, a burden, a reminder of how quickly life could spiral out of control. Back in her penthouse, Elena was discovering the answer to that question. She'd changed into silk pajamas and a cashmere robe, but she couldn't bring herself to take off Daniel's jacket. Instead, she'd wrapped it over her expensive sleepwear, finding comfort in its worn softness and the lingering scent of its owner. She sat at her kitchen island. Noah's drawing spread before her like evidence of a life she'd never known. The kitchen was a marvel of modern design, Italian marble countertops, professional-grade appliances, custom cabinetry that had been featured in Architectural Digest. But tonight, it felt like a museum, beautiful and untouchable, and utterly devoid of the warmth that radiated from a child's crayon masterpiece. Elena found herself studying every detail of the drawing, trying to piece together the story it told. The careful way Noah had drawn his father's jacket, the joy evident in the stick figure's poses, the love that practically vibrated off the construction paper in waves of blue and yellow and green. When had she last felt that kind of uncomplicated affection? Elena tried to remember, but her childhood memories were a carefully edited collection of survival strategies and hard-won lessons. She'd learned early that love was conditional, that families could disappear without warning, that the only person she could truly count on was herself. She'd been 7 when her parents died in the car accident, old enough to remember them, but young enough to adapt to the foster system with the resilience that children somehow manage to summon. But adaptation wasn't the same as thriving, and Elena had learned to navigate a world where care came with conditions and affection had to be earned through perfect behavior and excellent grades. She'd succeeded, of course. Elena had always succeeded. Valedictorian at 18, full scholarship to Columbia MBA from Wharton with highest honors. She'd joined Carter Industries as an analyst, worked her way up through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. When Richard Carter had died of a heart attack 5 years ago, leaving his company in shambles and his board in chaos, Elena had been the only one with both the vision and the ruthlessness to save it. But success, she was discovering, was a cold companion on nights like this. Elena pulled out her laptop and typed Daniel's name into the search engine, not sure what she expected to find. The results were sparse and heartbreaking. A few news articles from 18 months ago about an environmental engineer convicted of embezzlement. A LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated since his arrest. A brief mention in a local paper about a custody hearing. The details emerged like pieces of a puzzle. Daniel Hayes, age 38, formerly employed by Meridian Environmental Solutions, arrested for diverting funds from a cleanup project. Wife Sarah had died of cancer 7 months before his conviction. Son Noah, age 7, placed in care of relatives following his father's incarceration. Elena stared at the screen, her heart breaking for the man who'd given her his only protection against the cold. The articles painted a picture of a good man who'd made a terrible choice out of desperation and love. A father who'd tried to save his wife and lost everything in the process. She closed the laptop and picked up Noah's drawing again, understanding now why Daniel carried it with him like a talisman. It was proof that he'd once been loved unconditionally, that somewhere in California, a little boy was probably lying awake wondering when his daddy was coming home. The clock on Elena's stove read 2:17. But she felt more awake than she had in years. She moved to the wall of windows that dominated her living room, looking out at the city that stretched before her like a glittering circuit board. Somewhere out there, Daniel was facing another night on the streets. Somewhere out there, a child was missing his father. And here she was, surrounded by luxury and accomplishment, feeling emptier than she'd ever felt in her life. Elena had always prided herself on her rationality, on her ability to make decisions based on logic rather than emotion. But tonight, with Daniel's jacket wrapped around her shoulders and his son's love letter in her hands, she found herself making a choice that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the ache in her chest that had been growing stronger since the moment she'd looked into his eyes. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for her head of security. James Morrison was a former FBI agent who handled sensitive matters for Carter Industries, the kind of man who could find anyone anywhere without asking uncomfortable questions. "Ms. Carter," James answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "Is everything all right?" "I need you to find someone," Elena said without preamble. "Daniel Hayes. He's homeless probably somewhere in Manhattan. I need to know where he is and what his situation is. Can you do that?" "Of course, may I ask?" "It's personal," Elena cut him off. "And James, I need this done quietly. No official channels, no paper trail. Just find him." "Understood. I'll have information for you by morning." Elena hung up and returned to the windows, watching the snow continue to fall over the city. She thought about Daniel shivering somewhere in the cold, about Noah sleeping in a strange bed 3,000 miles away, about the chain of circumstances that had brought them all to this moment. For the first time in her adult life, Elena Carter was about to do something that made no business sense, offered no strategic advantage, and promised no measurable return on investment. She was about to follow her heart, and the thought terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. At that same moment, Daniel was walking through the snow-covered streets of Lower Manhattan, having given up on finding shelter for the night. The coffee had helped warm him from the inside, but without his jacket, the cold was beginning to take a serious toll. His fingers were numb, his lips blue, and he could feel the early stages of hypothermia setting in. He found himself thinking about the drawing in his jacket pocket, wondering if Elena had discovered it yet. The picture had been Noah's last gift to him before the custody hearing pressed into his hands with the fierce urgency that only children seemed to possess. "Keep it forever, Daddy," Noah had whispered, his small arms wrapped around Daniel's neck. "So you don't forget me." As if he could ever forget. As if a day had passed since the hearing that Daniel hadn't thought about his son's laugh, his endless questions about how engines worked, and why fish lived underwater, and whether airplanes ever got tired of flying. Noah had inherited his mother's curiosity and his father's determination, a combination that promised great things if only he had the chance to grow up with the love and stability he deserved. Daniel ducked into the doorway of a closed restaurant, trying to escape the worst of the wind. His body was shaking uncontrollably now, and he knew he was in real danger. He thought about calling 911, but the thought of spending the night in a hospital emergency room, surrounded by the chaos and desperation of the city's forgotten people, seemed almost worse than freezing on the street. Instead, he found himself thinking about Elena Carter, about the moment when she'd accepted his jacket, and her entire demeanor had changed. There had been something in her eyes, a recognition that went beyond simple gratitude. It was as if she'd seen something in his gesture that reminded her of who she used to be or who she wanted to be. Daniel pulled Elena's business card from his pocket, the edges soft from repeated handling. The paper was expensive, heavy stock with a subtle texture that spoke of quality and attention to detail. Everything about it suggested power and success, a world as far from his current reality as the moon. But he remembered the way Elena had looked at him, the genuine warmth in her voice when she'd said his name. Maybe, just maybe, the business card was more than just a polite gesture. Maybe it was an invitation to hope for something better. As the snow continued to fall and the city slept around him, Daniel Hayes made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. When morning came, he would call the number on Elena Carter's business card. He would take the chance that a billionaire CEO might remember a homeless man who'd given her his coat, and that sometimes miracles happened to people who'd stopped believing in them. But first, he had to survive the night. Daniel pulled the thin blanket from the shelter tighter around his shoulders and settled in to wait for dawn, Elena's business card pressed against his heart, like a promise of redemption he wasn't sure he deserved, but desperately needed to believe in. High above the city, Elena stood at her window and watched the snow blanket the streets below Daniel's jacket, still wrapped around her shoulders like a shield against the loneliness that had been her constant companion for so many years. In a few hours, James would call with information about Daniel's whereabouts. In a few hours, she would have to decide what to do with the feelings that had been awakened by a simple act of kindness. But for now, she held Noah's drawing against her chest and allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to be part of a family again, to have someone who loved her with the fierce, uncomplicated devotion of a child's heart. The thought should have terrified her Elena Carter, who controlled billion-dollar deals and commanded corporate empires afraid of a 7-year-old's love. Instead, it filled her with a longing so intense it took her breath away. The first pale light of dawn was creeping across the Manhattan skyline when Elena's phone rang, pulling her from the restless half-sleep she'd finally managed in the chair by her window. She'd never made it to bed, Daniel's jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, Noah's drawing clutched in her hand like a lifeline to a world she'd never known. "Ms. Carter," James Morrison's voice was crisp despite the early hour. "I have the information you requested." Elena sat up straighter, her heart suddenly racing. "Where is he?" Daniel Hayes spent the night in a doorway on Broome Street. "He's currently at the Bowery Mission, where they serve breakfast starting at 6. Ms. Carter, I should tell you his situation is more dire than you might expect. No fixed address, no income, no support system. He's been on the streets for over a year." Elena closed her eyes, the image of Daniel shivering in a doorway, cutting through her like a blade. What about his son? There was a pause on the other end of the line. How did you know about... Just tell me about the boy James. Noah Hayes, age 7. He's in foster care with his aunt in San Diego. From what I can gather, Mr. Hayes has had minimal contact since losing custody. The aunt is less than enthusiastic about maintaining the relationship. Elena's grip tightened on the phone. What do you mean? She's moved twice since taking custody, and there's no indication that Mr. Hayes has been given the new addresses. It appears she's trying to sever the connection entirely. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Somewhere in California, a little boy was being systematically separated from the father he loved, while that same father froze on the streets of New York, carrying his son's drawing like a sacred relic. There's something else, James continued. Mr. Hayes has a medical condition, diabetes. Without proper medication and nutrition, his situation is becoming increasingly dangerous. Elena stood abruptly, pacing to the window as the implications crashed over her. Daniel wasn't just homeless. He was dying slowly, one cold night at a time, while his son grew up believing his father had abandoned him. I need you to do something else for me, Elena said, her voice steady, despite the turmoil in her chest. I need you to find out everything you can about Noah's situation. Legal options, custody laws, what it would take to... She stopped herself, surprised by the direction her thoughts had taken. Ms. Carter. Never mind that for now. Just keep monitoring Daniel's location. And James, I want you to prepare a file on Carter Industries' community outreach programs, specifically anything related to workforce development or second chance employment. Of course. Should I schedule a meeting with the board to discuss? No board meeting. This is my decision. Elena ended the call and stood in the growing light of dawn, her reflection ghost-like in the window glass. What was she doing? In the span of 12 hours, she'd gone from her carefully ordered life to considering... What exactly? Helping a homeless man was one thing, but the thoughts swirling through her mind went far beyond simple charity. She thought about Noah's drawing, about the love that radiated from every crayon stroke. She thought about Daniel's eyes when he'd given her his jacket, the quiet dignity in his voice when he'd said her name. Most of all, she thought about the hollow feeling that had lived in her chest for so many years, the sense that all her success meant nothing if she faced it alone. Elena had built her empire on calculated risks, on the ability to see potential where others saw problems. And as she stood in her penthouse watching the city wake up below, she realized she was about to make the biggest gamble of her life. 20 blocks away, Daniel sat at a long table in the Bowery Mission's dining hall, forcing himself to eat the scrambled eggs and toast that tasted like cardboard in his mouth. His body was still recovering from the night's ordeal, his fingers were only now regaining feeling, and his chest ached with every breath. But he was alive, and that was more than he'd been certain of a few hours ago. The dining hall was filled with the city's forgotten people, men and women, whose stories of loss and survival could fill libraries. Some ate in silence. Others maintained quiet conversations about jobs and shelter availability and the endless bureaucracy of trying to exist without an address. Daniel had learned to navigate this world, but he'd never quite accepted it as his permanent reality. You look like hell, brother. The voice belonged to Marcus Williams, a former construction worker who'd been living on the streets for 3 years after a back injury cost him his job and his apartment. Marcus had taken Daniel under his wing during those first terrifying weeks on the street, teaching him which shelters were safe and which ones to avoid, where to find free meals, and how to stay invisible when the police were clearing an area. Long night, Daniel replied, managing a weak smile. But I'm still here. That's what matters. Listen, I heard there might be some day work down at the docks. Cash under the table, no questions asked. You interested? Daniel nodded, though the thought of physical labor in his current condition made his bones ache. Yeah, I'll check it out. Thanks, Marcus. As he finished his breakfast, Daniel found himself thinking about Elena Carter's business card, still safely tucked in his shirt pocket. In the harsh light of morning, his plan to call her seemed impossibly naive. What could he possibly say? Thank you for taking my jacket. Please remember the homeless man who briefly interrupted your life. But then he thought about Noah, about the custody hearing, where his son had begged the judge to let him stay with his daddy. The memory was a knife in his chest, but it also reminded him why giving up wasn't an option. Every day he survived was another day closer to getting his life back together, another day closer to bringing his son home. Daniel was about to leave for the docks when his name was called from the mission's front desk. He approached cautiously, wondering if he'd somehow violated one of the countless regulations that governed the lives of the homeless. Daniel Hayes. The woman behind the desk was middle-aged and kind, with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much suffering. There's someone here to see you. Daniel's blood ran cold. Police. No, honey. A woman. Says she knows you. Elena Carter stood in the mission's lobby like an exotic bird in a barnyard, her designer coat and perfect posture marking her as clearly out of place as if she'd been wearing a neon sign. She'd changed out of her evening wear into a charcoal wool coat and dark jeans, but even dressed down, she radiated the kind of confidence that only came with real power. Daniel approached slowly, his mind racing. How had she found him? Why had she come? The other men in the lobby were staring, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Women like Elena Carter didn't visit places like the Bowery Mission unless they were slumming for a photo opportunity or working on a tax-deductible donation. Daniel. Elena's voice was softer than he remembered, and when she turned to face him, he saw something in her eyes that took his breath away. She was nervous. Elena Carter, the woman who commanded boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, was actually nervous about talking to him. Elena. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly aware of how he must look unshaven, wearing clothes that smelled of the street, his hair still damp from the mission's shower. What are you doing here? I wanted to return your jacket, she said, but even as she spoke, Daniel could tell that wasn't the whole truth. And I wanted to make sure you were all right. Last night when I saw you at the bus stop, you were worried about me. The question came out more skeptical than Daniel had intended, but the idea seemed too impossible to accept. Elena's cheeks flushed slightly. Is that so hard to believe? Daniel looked around the lobby, taking in the curious stares from the other residents, the way the mission staff were trying to pretend they weren't eavesdropping on every word. Can we talk somewhere more private? Elena nodded and followed him outside into the crisp morning air. The street was beginning to fill with the early commuter crowd, people in expensive suits hurrying past the mission's entrance without making eye contact with its residents. Daniel led Elena around the corner to a small park where they could talk without an audience. Here, Elena said, holding out a garment bag. Your jacket. I had it cleaned. Daniel took the bag, surprised by its weight. You didn't have to do that. I found something in the pocket, Elena said quietly. A drawing from Noah. Daniel's hand tightened on the garment bag. You read it. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to invade your privacy, but it's okay. Daniel's voice was rough with emotion. He made it for me before I lost custody. He wanted me to have something to remember him, but so. Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. I looked you up. I know what happened. Your wife, the embezzlement, losing your son, I'm sorry. Daniel felt the familiar surge of shame and anger that always accompanied discussions of his past. Then you know what kind of man I am. A thief, a failure, someone who couldn't even keep his family together. No. Elena's voice was sharp, cutting through his self-recrimination. I know you're a man who tried to save his wife's life. I know you're a father who loves his son enough to carry his picture everywhere you go. I know you're someone who would give his only coat to a stranger in the cold. The unexpected fierceness in her voice stopped Daniel cold. He stared at her, seeing not the polished CEO from magazine covers, but a woman with tears in her eyes standing in a pocket park in Lower Manhattan, defending a man she barely knew. Why are you here, Elena? Daniel asked softly. Really? Elena looked down at her hands, then back up at him. Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about last night. About what you did for me, about the kind of person who makes that choice. And because, she took a deep breath, because I want to help. Help how? I run a company, Daniel, a big company with a lot of resources. I have connections, influence, money. I could, no. Daniel's response was immediate and firm. I don't want your charity. Elena's eyes flashed. It's not charity, it's, what is it then? Daniel's voice was rising, drawing looks from passers-by. Guilt, some kind of rich person's redemption project. Find the noble homeless man and fix his life so you can feel better about yourself. The words were cruel, born from years of accumulated pain and rejection, but Daniel saw immediately that they'd hit their mark. Elena flinched as if he'd slapped her, and for a moment, her carefully constructed composure cracked completely. You're right, she said quietly. You're absolutely right. I am trying to fix something, but it's not my guilt, Daniel. It's my life. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Daniel studied Elena's face, seeing past the designer clothes and perfect makeup to something raw and honest underneath. What do you mean? Elena looked around the small park, at the handful of office workers eating early lunches and the mothers pushing strollers along the pathways. I have everything, Daniel. More money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, a company that employs thousands of people, apartments and houses and cars, and all the things that are supposed to make you happy. And I'm the loneliest person I know. She turned back to him, and Daniel saw that her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Last night when you gave me your jacket, it was the first genuine human connection I've had in years. Not someone wanting something from me, not someone afraid of me, not someone trying to impress me, just kindness. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at me the way you did. How did I look at you? Like I was worth saving. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. He thought about the woman he'd seen at the bus stop shivering and alone, and realized he'd seen past the expensive clothes to something much more fundamental, another human being in need. You are worth saving, Daniel said quietly. But you don't need me to do it. You have everything. I have nothing that matters. Elena's voice was fierce now, passionate in a way that transformed her entire demeanor. I spent my whole life building walls, Daniel. Building success and power and control, because I was terrified of being vulnerable again. And last night, a homeless man gave me his coat, and those walls just crumbled. Daniel felt something shifting inside his chest, a crack in the armor of cynicism he'd built around his heart. Elena, I'm not trying to fix you, she continued. I'm trying to figure out if maybe somehow we could fix each other. Before Daniel could respond, Elena reached into her purse and pulled out Noah's drawing, now carefully protected, in a clear plastic sleeve. I want to help you get your son back. The words stopped Daniel's heart. What? I've already had my legal team start researching the case. There are options, Daniel. Appeals, custody modifications, interstate jurisdiction issues. It won't be easy, but it's possible. Daniel stared at the drawing in Elena's hands, his son's careful crayon strokes now somehow precious beyond measure. Why would you do that? Because every child deserves to be with a parent who loves them that much. Because I know what it's like to grow up without that connection. And because... Elena paused, seeming to gather her courage. Because I think I'm falling in love with a man who would give away his only protection from the cold to help a stranger. The confession hung in the air between them, brave and terrifying, and completely honest. Daniel felt the world tilt on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about his life suddenly called into question. You don't know me, Daniel said weakly. You don't know what I've done, what I'm capable of. I know enough. Elena stepped closer, her voice gentle but unwavering. I know you're a good man who made a mistake out of love. I know you're a father who carries his son's picture like a prayer. I know you're someone who chooses kindness even when kindness has been in short supply in your own life. Daniel looked into Elena's eyes and saw something that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He saw hope, not the desperate, clinging hope he'd sustained himself with for months, but real, tangible hope, backed by resources and determination, and the kind of love he'd thought was lost to him forever. What are you asking me to do? Daniel whispered. I'm asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me help you rebuild your life not as charity, but as partnership. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that sometimes the universe puts two broken people in each other's path because together they might become something whole. Elena reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against Daniel's hand. I'm asking you to come home with me, Daniel, to let me give you a place to sleep and food to eat, and the stability you need to fight for your son. And in return, maybe you could teach me what it feels like to be part of a family again. Daniel stared at her, this powerful woman who could buy and sell entire city blocks, asking him, a homeless man with nothing to offer but a damaged heart and the desperate love of a father, to save her from a loneliness she'd finally found the courage to admit. Elena, Don't answer now, she said quickly. Think about it. Take the day, take the week if you need it. But Daniel... She pressed Noah's drawing into his hands. Your son needs his father, and maybe his father needs to remember that he's worthy of love too. She turned to go, then stopped and looked back at him one more time. I'll be at my office if you want to talk. Carter Industries, 5th Avenue. Ask for me personally, they'll know to let you up. Elena walked away, leaving Daniel standing in the small park with his son's drawing in one hand and the weight of impossible hope pressing against his chest like a bird trying to take flight. Around him, the city continued its relentless pace, millions of people pursuing their own dreams and disasters, unaware that in a pocket of green space in Lower Manhattan, a homeless man was contemplating a second chance at redemption that seemed too good to be true. But as Daniel looked down at Noah's careful crayon drawing, at the words, "I love you, Daddy," written in a child's earnest hand, he realized that maybe some things were worth believing in after all. Maybe some risks were worth taking, even when the fall could destroy what little remained of his heart. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop surviving and start living again. Daniel carefully folded the drawing and put it back in his pocket next to Elena Carter's business card. Then he turned toward Fifth Avenue, toward a future he couldn't quite imagine, but was finally ready to reach for one uncertain step at a time. Daniel stood on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street for nearly an hour, watching the endless stream of perfectly dressed people flowing in and out of the Carter Industries building, like blood through the arteries of capitalism. The glass and steel tower stretched 43 floors into the gray December sky, its facade reflecting the city back at itself in pristine, distorted fragments. He'd walked the 26 blocks from the park, slowly his mind churning, with Elena's words, her impossible offer, the look in her eyes, when she'd said she might be falling in love with him. Every rational thought told him to walk away, to return to the familiar misery of the streets, rather than risk the kind of hope that could destroy what little remained of his sanity. But Noah's drawing burned against his chest like a talisman, and Elena's business card had grown soft from the warmth of his fingers. 3 times he'd approached the building's entrance, and 3 times he'd turned away, paralyzed by the magnitude of what she was offering, and terrified of what it might cost them both. "You going in, or just admiring the architecture?" The voice belonged to a security guard who'd emerged from the lobby, a man in his 50s with kind eyes, and the patient demeanor of someone who'd seen every variety of human behavior in his years of watching New York's streets. Daniel looked down at himself, still wearing the mission's donated clothes, his hair still damp from their communal shower, carrying the unmistakable markers of homelessness that made him invisible to most of the city's residents. "I have an appointment," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. The guard studied him for a moment, and Daniel braced himself for the inevitable dismissal. Instead, the man nodded toward the entrance. "Ms. Carter's expecting you. She left word with the front desk, Daniel Hayes VIP treatment, no questions asked. That's you, I'm guessing." Daniel nodded, stunned by the casual way the guard delivered this information, as if billionaire CEOs regularly left instructions for homeless men to be given VIP treatment. 38th floor executive suite. They'll take care of you at reception. The guard held the door open with a smile that contained no judgment, only professional courtesy. "And son, whatever brought you here today, I hope it works out for you." The lobby of Carter Industries was a cathedral of modern commerce, all marble floors and soaring ceilings, abstract art that probably cost more than most people's homes, and the subtle hum of serious money being made in serious ways. Daniel felt every eye in the space track his movement as he approached the reception desk, his footsteps echoing, despite his efforts to move quietly. The receptionist was a woman in her 30s, with the kind of professional polish that came from working in the upper echelons of corporate America. When she looked up at Daniel, her expression remained perfectly neutral, though he caught the slight widening of her eyes as she took in his appearance. "Daniel Hayes," he said quietly. "I'm here to see Elena Carter." "Of course, Mr. Hayes. Ms. Carter is expecting you. Margaret from her office will be right down to escort you up." The receptionist's voice carried no hint of the questions that must have been racing through her mind. "Please have a seat. Can I get you anything, coffee, water?" Daniel accepted a bottle of water and sat in one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than he'd ever made in a month. Around him, the lobby hummed with activity, executives in $1,000 suits, assistants carrying tablets and cell phones, the occasional client being ushered toward the elevator banks, with the kind of deference reserved for people who moved markets with their decisions. "Mr. Hayes." A woman in her 40s approached wearing a navy blue dress and the confident smile of someone who managed the impossible on a daily basis. "I'm Margaret Wilson, Ms. Carter's executive assistant. She's ready to see you now." The elevator ride to the 38th floor was silent except for the soft, classical music piped through hidden speakers. Margaret made no small talk, for which Daniel was grateful. He spent the 40-second journey trying to prepare himself for whatever was about to happen, but realized there was no preparation for this kind of moment. Elena's office was a monument to controlled power, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Central Park and the city beyond. The furniture was understated, but clearly expensive, the kind of pieces that whispered rather than shouted their quality. But what struck Daniel most was how personal the space felt, despite its corporate grandeur. Framed photographs on the desk books that looked actually read rather than decoratively arranged, a small collection of what appeared to be children's artwork mounted on one wall. Elena rose from behind her desk as he entered, and Daniel was struck again by the transformation in her appearance. She wore a charcoal gray suit that was clearly custom-tailored. Her hair was perfectly styled, and every element of her presentation spoke of absolute command. But her eyes held the same vulnerability he'd seen in the park, the same desperate hope that seemed to mirror his own. "Daniel." She moved around the desk, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "You came." "I almost didn't," Daniel admitted. "About 6 times." Elena's smile was understanding tinged with relief. "I wasn't sure you would. After what I said, after what I asked, I know it must seem impossible." "Impossible is one word for it." Daniel looked around the office, taking in the obvious trappings of success. "Elena, I need you to understand something. I'm not a project to be fixed. I'm not some feel-good story you can tell at charity galas. I'm a man who's lost everything, who's made choices that cost him his family, who sleeps in doorways and eats in soup kitchens. If you're looking for redemption, you're looking at the wrong person." Elena stepped closer, her expression serious. "And I need you to understand something. I'm not some lonely rich woman looking for a pet cause. I'm someone who spent her entire adult life building walls so high that I forgot what it felt like to be human. What happened between us last night, what's happening right now, it's not about fixing anyone. It's about the possibility that 2 people who've lost their way might find something together that neither could find alone." The sincerity in her voice cut through Daniel's defenses like a blade. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust in the impossible hope she was offering. But years of disappointment had taught him to be wary of promises that seemed too good to be true. "Tell me about the job," Daniel said. "The real job, not some made-up position to make me feel useful." Elena walked to one of the windows, gazing out at the city spread below. "Carter Industries has a community development division. We work on projects in underserved neighborhoods housing infrastructure, environmental cleanup. Real work that makes a real difference in people's lives." She turned back to him, her expression intent. "Your background is in environmental engineering. Before everything happened, you were good at your job. The cleanup project you were working on when the embezzlement happened, I've read the reports. Your methodology was innovative, ahead of its time. The irony is that your techniques are now being used as industry standard." Daniel felt a stab of bitter pride. The work he'd done at Meridian had been some of the best of his career, revolutionary approaches to soil remediation that could have changed how the industry addressed contamination. It had all been overshadowed by his crime, but the science had been sound. "What are you offering?" Daniel asked. "A position as senior environmental consultant for community development projects. Real work, real responsibility, a real salary. You'd be leading a team of engineers and scientists working on cleanup projects in neighborhoods that have been ignored for decades." Elena pulled a folder from her desk and handed it to him. "This is the Greenpoint Project in Brooklyn. 60 years of industrial contamination, 3,000 families living on poisoned ground, and no one willing to take on the challenge because the liability issues are too complex." Daniel opened the folder and found himself looking at soil composition charts, contamination maps, and environmental impact studies. Despite himself, he felt the familiar excitement that came with a challenging problem, the engineer's instinct to find solutions where others saw only obstacles. "This is incredibly complex work," Daniel said, scanning the technical specifications. "The remediation would take years, cost millions." 47 million according to our preliminary estimates, Elena said. "And yes, it will take years, but we've committed to the project because it's the right thing to do. Those families deserve to live on clean soil, to have clean water, to not worry about their children playing in their own backyards." Daniel looked up from the folder, studying Elena's face. "And you want me to lead this?" "I want you to head the entire environmental division. All of our cleanup projects, all of our green infrastructure initiatives." "Daniel, I've done my research. Before your conviction, you were one of the most innovative engineers in the field. That expertise doesn't disappear because of one terrible decision made in desperate circumstances." The offer was staggering beyond anything Daniel had dared to hope for, but it also raised questions that gnawed at him like hungry wolves. "Elena, why me? You could hire anyone, people with pristine records and impressive references. Why take a chance on someone with my history?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the city beyond the windows. When she spoke, her voice was soft but certain. "Because you understand what it means to lose everything. Because you know what these communities are going through in a way that someone who's never faced real hardship could never understand. Because the kind of person who gives away his only coat to a stranger is exactly the kind of person I want leading projects that are supposed to help people." She turned back to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And because I think you might be the only person I've ever met who sees me as more than just my money or my power. When you looked at me last night, you saw someone worth saving. That's not something I can put a price on." Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the sensation of hope trying to take root in soil that had been barren for too long. "What about my record? The conviction, the time in minimum security? We'll handle it. Full disclosure to the board, complete transparency about your background. But Daniel, you served your time. You paid your debt to society. Everyone deserves a second chance, especially someone who lost everything trying to save the person they loved most." The words hung between them like a bridge, and Daniel realized he was standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. He could walk away, return to the streets and the familiar misery of survival. Or he could take Elena's hand and step into a future that seemed too bright to be real. "There's something else," Elena said, and the sudden nervousness in her voice made Daniel's heart race. "I want to help you get Noah back." The folder slipped from Daniel's hands, papers scattering across the expensive carpet. "What?" "I've already retained the best family law attorney in California. Sarah Martinez. She specializes in custody cases involving wrongful separation. She thinks we have grounds for an appeal, especially if you can demonstrate stable employment and housing." Daniel sank into one of the leather chairs, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Elena was proposing. "Elena, you don't understand. The judge, the social worker, they all agreed that I was unfit. They said Noah was better off without me. They said a homeless ex-convict with no income was unfit to raise a child. They never said a successful environmental engineer with stable employment and a loving heart was unfit to be a father." Elena knelt beside his chair, her hand gently covering his. "Daniel, I've seen Noah's drawing. I've seen the way you carry his memory, like it's the most precious thing in the world. That little boy needs his father, and his father needs to believe he's worthy of love." Daniel stared down at their joined hands, Elena's manicured fingers intertwined with his work-roughened ones. The touch was electric, sending warmth through his body that had nothing to do with physical comfort and everything to do with human connection. Why are you doing this? Daniel whispered. Really? Not the corporate social responsibility answer, not the feel-good justification. Why are you risking everything for someone you barely know? Elena's grip on his hand tightened. Because 24 hours ago, I was standing in my empty penthouse surrounded by everything I thought I wanted, and I realized I had nothing that actually mattered. No one who loved me for who I was rather than what I could do for them. No one who would miss me if I disappeared tomorrow. She took a shaky breath, her composure finally cracking. And then a man who had every reason to be bitter and selfish and cruel gave me his only protection against the cold. Not because he wanted something from me, not because he knew who I was, but because he saw another human being in need and chose kindness. Tears were flowing freely down Elena's cheeks now, and Daniel found himself reaching up to wipe them away with his thumb. Elena, I'm 34 years old, Daniel. I've spent 15 years building a company, accumulating wealth, gaining power. And I've never once felt as alive as I did in that moment when you wrapped your jacket around my shoulders. I've never felt as seen, as valued, as worthy of protection. Elena stood and moved to her desk, pulling out a legal document. I've had my lawyers draw up a contract. Full employment with Carter Industries, including health insurance, housing allowance, and legal support for custody proceedings. But Daniel, I need you to know this isn't contingent on anything personal between us. This is a legitimate job offer based on your qualifications. What happens between us as people, that's separate. That's a choice we both have to make freely. Daniel looked at the contract, the official letterhead, and legal language that could transform his life with the stroke of a pen. You're serious about this? Dead serious. But I'm also serious about something else. Elena returned to stand before him, her hands clasped in front of her like a supplicant. I'm serious about wanting to see where this could go between us. Not as employer and employee, not as savior and saved, but as two people who found something unexpected in each other. Daniel stood slowly, his mind reeling with the implications of what she was offering. A job, a chance to get his son back, and the possibility of love with a woman who could have anyone she wanted, but had chosen to place her heart in the hands of a man who had nothing to offer but his damaged soul. I'm scared, Daniel admitted. Terrified, actually. I've been living day to day for so long that the idea of planning for a future seems impossible. And the thought of disappointing you, of failing again. You won't fail, Elena said with quiet certainty. Not if we do this together. Not if we're honest with each other about what we want and what we're afraid of. Daniel looked into her eyes and saw his own hope reflected back at him, multiplied and magnified until it seemed to fill the room with light. What do you want, Elena, really want? I want to fall asleep next to someone who loves me for who I am underneath all of this. She gestured at her office, her success, the empire she'd built. I want to wake up in the morning with a reason to be excited about the day beyond profit margins and board meetings. I want to help you get your son back, and then I want to learn how to be part of a family. Elena's voice dropped to a whisper. I want to love you, Daniel. I want to love Noah. I want to build something real and lasting and beautiful out of the broken pieces we've both been carrying around for too long. The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Daniel felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling, the protective cynicism that had kept him functional on the streets dissolving in the face of Elena's radical honesty. I don't know how to do this, Daniel said. I don't know how to trust in good things anymore. I don't know how to believe that I deserve the kind of happiness you're talking about. Then we'll learn together, Elena replied. We'll take it one day at a time, one choice at a time. We'll make mistakes, we'll have setbacks, we'll probably drive each other crazy. But Daniel, what we found last night, that connection, That recognition that doesn't happen every day. That's the kind of rare, precious thing that's worth fighting for. Daniel looked down at the contract in his hands, then at Noah's drawing peeking out from his shirt pocket, then finally at Elena's face, open and vulnerable and beautiful in its honesty. He thought about the man he used to be before grief and desperation had driven him to make choices that cost him everything. He thought about the father Noah remembered, the one who read bedtime stories and explained how airplanes worked and made pancakes shaped like dinosaurs on Saturday mornings. Maybe that man wasn't gone forever. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right chance to step back into the light. Daniel picked up the pen from Elena's desk, his hand steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. "If we do this," he said, "if I sign this contract and take this job and try to build something with you, I need you to know that I come with baggage. Trauma Trust issues a son who might not even remember me, and enough guilt to sink a battleship. And I need you to know that I come with control issues, abandonment, fears, a board of directors who think I've lost my mind, and absolutely no idea how to be in a healthy relationship," Elena replied. "Does that change anything?" Daniel smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in months. "It makes me think we might be perfect for each other." He signed the contract with a flourish, the ink sealing not just an employment agreement, but a promise to believe in second chances, in the possibility of redemption, in the radical idea that love could bloom in the most unlikely places. Elena's answering smile was radiant, transforming her entire face and filling the office with warmth that had nothing to do with the heating system. "Welcome to Carter Industries, Daniel Hayes. And welcome to whatever this is we're building together." As they stood in her office high above the city, surrounded by the trappings of success, but focused only on each other, Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. For the first time in years, the future seemed full of possibility rather than mere survival. Somewhere in California, Noah was probably finishing lunch at his foster home, unaware that his father was taking the first steps toward bringing him home. Somewhere in the back of Daniel's mind, the voice that had whispered of redemption grew stronger, more insistent, more real. The road ahead would be challenging, full of legal battles and personal struggles, and the difficult work of learning to trust again. But as Elena's hand found his, as her fingers intertwined with his, in a gesture that spoke of partnership and promised, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the best was yet to come. 1 year later, Daniel stood in front of the mirror. In what had become his apartment, Elena had insisted he needed his own space while they figured out their relationship, adjusting a tie that still felt foreign around his neck. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the silver frame on his dresser, and he paused to look at the photograph inside. Noah, gap-toothed and grinning, arms wrapped around his father's neck during their first reunion visit 6 months ago. The legal battle had been longer and more complicated than either Daniel or Elena had anticipated. Sarah Martinez, the family attorney Elena had retained, had warned them that custody cases involving previous criminal convictions were always uphill battles, even when the circumstances were sympathetic. But Elena had been relentless, using every resource at her disposal, while being careful not to overstep the legal boundaries that could have jeopardized their case. The breakthrough had come when they'd discovered that Noah's Aunt Patricia had been receiving state assistance for his care, while simultaneously denying Daniel any contact information or visitation rights. The court had taken a dim view of what appeared to be deliberate interference with the father-child relationship, especially when Daniel could demonstrate stable employment, housing, and the kind of support system that showed genuine commitment to rehabilitation. Daniel's work at Carter Industries had exceeded even Elena's optimistic expectations. The Greenpoint project was ahead of schedule and under budget, with preliminary soil samples showing contamination levels dropping faster than their most aggressive projections had predicted. The community had embraced him, with a warmth that still surprised him. Former gang members and elderly grandmothers alike seemed to recognize something authentic in his commitment to their neighborhood. More importantly, Daniel had rediscovered the passion for environmental work that had driven him through college and into his first career. Standing in contaminated soil, explaining to worried mothers how they were going to make their children's playgrounds safe again, he felt connected to something larger than his own survival for the first time since Sarah's death. But today wasn't about work, wasn't about the slow process of environmental remediation or the careful rebuilding of professional reputation. Today was about something far more precious and terrifying. Noah was coming home. The custody agreement was provisional supervised visits that would gradually increase in length and independence as Daniel demonstrated consistent stability. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall that had separated him from his son for almost 2 years. In 3 hours, Daniel would drive to JFK Airport to meet the flight bringing Noah from San Diego for his first extended visit. Elena knocked on his apartment door at precisely 9:30, as punctual as always, but carrying a nervous energy that Daniel had learned to recognize. She'd been as invested in the custody case as if Noah were her own child, spending countless hours with attorneys and social workers, quietly using her influence to ensure that Daniel's case received the attention it deserved, without appearing to buy favorable treatment. "You ready for this?" Elena asked, though her own hands were trembling slightly as she straightened his tie with unnecessary precision. "No," Daniel admitted. "But I don't think anyone's ever ready to see their child for the first time in 2 years. I keep wondering if he'll remember me, if he'll want to come home, if I'll know how to be his father again." Elena's fingers stilled on his collar, and she looked up into his eyes with the kind of direct gaze that had first captured his attention that night at the bus stop. "Daniel Hayes, you never stopped being his father. Not when you lost your job. Not when you lost your home, not when you lost custody. You carried that little boy's love with you through everything, and that's not something you can lose or forget how to do." Over the past year, Daniel had watched Elena slowly shed the protective armor she'd worn in the boardroom, revealing layers of vulnerability and humor and fierce loyalty that took his breath away. She'd supported his recovery without trying to control it, had celebrated his professional victories without claiming credit for making them possible, and had somehow managed to love him through his darkest moments of doubt and self-recrimination. They'd moved slowly, both too damaged by their respective pasts to rush into anything that felt like permanence. But somewhere along the way, Elena's penthouse had begun to feel like home in a way Daniel's apartment never quite managed. Somewhere along the way, he'd started imagining a future that included not just survival, but genuine happiness. The drive to the airport took them through neighborhoods Daniel had come to know intimately through his work communities, where families struggled with the invisible legacy of industrial contamination, where children played on soil that had been poisoned by decades of corporate negligence and governmental indifference. But there were signs of hope everywhere now. Green spaces reclaimed from brownfields, community gardens where toxin-resistant plants were slowly beginning to heal the earth. "I've been thinking," Elena said, as they navigated the airport traffic, her voice carrying the careful tone she used when broaching subjects she wasn't sure how to discuss. "About after Noah gets settled, about what comes next for us." Daniel's heart rate spiked, though he tried to keep his voice casual. "What about it?" "I want us to move in together. Officially, permanently. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. I want to help you raise Noah if he'll let me. I want to build something real with you, something that lasts." The confession hung between them like a bridge, and Daniel felt the familiar vertigo that came with the possibility of genuine happiness. "Elena," I know it's fast. I know there are complications with Noah adjusting, and the custody situation still being provisional. But Daniel, I love you. Not the project version of you, not the success story you've become, but you. The man who gave me his coat, who carries his son's drawing like a prayer, who chooses kindness, even when kindness seems impossible. Elena pulled into the airport parking structure, but neither of them made any move to get out of the car. I've never felt safer with another person than I feel with you. I've never felt more seen, more understood, more valued for who I am underneath all the money and power and corporate success. Daniel reached across the center console and took her hand, marveling at how perfectly their fingers fit together. I love you too. More than I thought it was possible to love another person after Sarah. But Elena, are you sure about this? About taking on an 8-year-old boy who might resent you for replacing his mother? About the complications of blending our lives when everything still feels so fragile? I'm terrified, Elena admitted with a laugh that bordered on hysteria. Absolutely terrified. I don't know how to be a stepmother, how to love someone else's child, how to navigate the complexities of a family that's been broken and rebuilt. But I know I want to try. I know that what we have is worth fighting for. They walked through the terminal hand in hand past the countless travelers pursuing their own journeys toward connection or separation, reunion, or farewell. Daniel's stomach churned with anxiety as they approached the arrival gate, his mind cycling through every possible disaster scenario while trying to focus on Elena's steady presence beside him. The flight from San Diego was on time, and Daniel found himself scanning the crowd of disembarking passengers with desperate intensity. Then suddenly, there he was, Noah 8 years old now, and taller than Daniel remembered, carrying a backpack that looked almost as big as he was, his dark hair, Sarah's hair, falling into eyes that were unmistakably his father's. For a moment, father and son simply stared at each other across the crowded gate area, 2 years of separation and longing compressed into a single heartbeat. Then Noah dropped his backpack and ran his small body, launching itself into Daniel's arms with the kind of faith that only children possess. Daddy. Noah's voice was muffled against Daniel's shoulder, but the word rang through the airport like a bell, announcing to the world that some bonds were stronger than time or distance or the accumulated weight of human failure. Daniel held his son as if he were made of spun glass, memorizing the weight of him, the scent of his hair, the fierce grip of his arms around his father's neck. Hey, buddy. He whispered, his voice thick with tears he didn't bother to hide. I missed you so much. I missed you too, Daddy. Aunt Patricia said you were sick, that you couldn't take care of me anymore. But I knew that was wrong. I knew you'd come back for me. The simple faith in Noah's voice broke something open in Daniel's chest, a reservoir of guilt and self-doubt that had been poisoning him for 2 years. His son had never stopped believing in him, had never stopped waiting for the father who'd carried his drawing like a sacred text through the darkest period of his life. Elena stood a few feet away, giving them space for their reunion, while tears streamed openly down her cheeks. Daniel looked up and caught her eye, extending his free hand toward her in invitation. She approached slowly, her expression uncertain, and Daniel realized she was as nervous about meeting Noah as he'd been about seeing his son again. Noah, Daniel said softly, I want you to meet someone very important to me. This is Elena. Noah studied Elena with the frank assessment that 8-year-olds brought to all new situations. She'd dressed carefully for this meeting, jeans and a sweater instead of her usual business attire, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Everything calculated to seem approachable rather than intimidating. Are you Daddy's girlfriend? Noah asked with characteristic directness. Elena's cheeks flushed pink, but her voice was steady when she replied, "I am. Is that okay with you?" Noah considered this for a long moment, his gaze moving between his father and Elena, with an intensity that suggested he understood the significance of this moment better than most adults would have given him credit for. "Do you love my daddy?" Noah asked. "Very much," Elena replied without hesitation. "And do you love me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Daniel held his breath as he watched Elena struggle with how to answer honestly, without overstepping boundaries that hadn't been established yet. "I don't know you well enough to love you yet," Elena said carefully. "But I would very much like to get to know you, and I think if you give me a chance I could love you very much. Would that be okay with you?" Noah nodded solemnly, then surprised them both by stepping forward and wrapping his arms around Elena's waist. "Daddy's been sad for a long time," he said matter-of-factly. "I'm glad you make him happy." The drive back into Manhattan was filled with Noah's chatter about school and friends in California, about the airplane ride, and his excitement about seeing his father's new apartment. But underneath the surface conversation, Daniel could sense his son processing the enormous changes in their lives, trying to understand how the pieces of their fractured family might fit back together. Daniel's apartment had been transformed for Noah's visit. Elena had helped him set up a bedroom, with furniture chosen specifically for an 8-year-old boy, a bed shaped like a race car, walls painted in Noah's favorite shade of blue, shelves waiting to be filled with books and toys, and all the accumulated treasures of childhood. "This is my room," Noah asked, his voice filled with wonder as he explored the space that had been created just for him. "This is your room," Daniel confirmed. "For visits now, but hopefully for more than that soon." Noah bounced on the bed, testing its springs, then moved to the window that offered a view of the small park across the street. "Daddy, do you think Mom would like Elena?" The question stopped Daniel cold. Sarah had been gone for over 3 years, but Noah's memories of his mother remained vivid and precious. Daniel had wondered how to navigate the complex emotions around his relationship with Elena, how to honor Sarah's memory while allowing room for new love to grow. "I think Mom would want us to be happy," Daniel said carefully. "And Elena makes me happy in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. What do you think Mom would say about that?" Noah was quiet for a long moment, his small face serious with the weight of 8-year-old wisdom. "I think she'd say you deserve to smile again. You used to smile all the time before she got sick. Elena makes you smile like that." The observation was so astute, so understanding of emotional complexities that most adults struggled with that Daniel found himself speechless. His son had inherited Sarah's emotional intelligence, along with her dark hair, her ability to see straight to the heart of things that others found confusing. Over the next few days, Daniel watched in amazement as Elena and Noah began to develop their own relationship. She approached his son with the same careful attention she brought to complex business negotiations, listening to his stories about school with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about his friends and hobbies and dreams for the future. Elena had never been around children much, her upbringing in foster care, and her single-minded focus on career success had left little room for learning how to connect with young people. But she seemed to instinctively understand that Noah needed consistency and patience rather than grand gestures, that building trust with a child who'd already experienced too much loss required time and authenticity. The breakthrough came on Noah's 4th day in New York. Elena had taken him to the Museum of Natural History, while Daniel finished some work at the office, and they'd returned home laughing about something involving dinosaurs and ice cream cones. Watching them together, seeing the easy affection that was beginning to develop between them, Daniel felt a piece of his heart that had been frozen for years finally begin to thaw. Elena, Noah said, as she helped him wash his hands before dinner. Can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. If you and Daddy get married, would I get to live with you all the time, not just for visits? Elena's hands stilled on the towel she was using to dry Noah's fingers. The question was complicated, touching on legal issues that were still being negotiated, emotional territories that hadn't been fully explored, and dreams that felt too fragile to examine too closely. Would you want that? Elena asked carefully. To live with your daddy and me all the time. More than anything, Noah replied with the fierce certainty that only children could muster. I want us to be a family, a real family that stays together. That evening, after Noah had fallen asleep in his new bed, Daniel and Elena sat on the couch in his living room, sharing a bottle of wine and trying to process the emotional whirlwind of the past few days. Elena was curled against Daniel's side, her head on his shoulder, both of them still marveling at how natural it felt to have Noah's presence fill the apartment with the particular energy that only children bring to a space. He asked me about marriage today, Elena said quietly, about all of us living together permanently. Daniel's arm tightened around her. What did you tell him? That I want it too, more than I've ever wanted anything in my life. Elena lifted her head to look at him, her eyes serious in the lamplight. Daniel, I know we've been taking things slowly, being careful not to rush into anything that might complicate the custody situation. But that little boy in there has already decided we're a family. Maybe it's time we made it official. Daniel felt his heart skip several beats. Are you asking me to marry you, Elena Carter? I'm asking you to build a life with me, to take the risk that what we've found together is strong enough to last, to trust that the love we have for each other and for Noah is worth betting everything on. Elena shifted so she was facing him directly, her hands framing his face with infinite tenderness. I'm asking you to marry me, Daniel Hayes. Not because it makes sense on paper, not because it solves legal complications, but because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because I love you with a completeness that scares and exhilarates me. Because I want to grow old with you and raise Noah together, and maybe someday add to our family in other ways. Daniel stared into her eyes, seeing his own hopes and fears reflected back at him, multiplied. A year ago, he'd been sleeping in doorways and eating in soup kitchens carrying his son's drawing, like a prayer for redemption he wasn't sure he deserved. Now, a woman who could have anyone in the world was asking him to spend his life with her, offering to help him raise the child who meant more to him than his own survival. Yes. Daniel whispered the word, carrying with it all the accumulated longing of 2 years of separation, all the desperate hope of a man who'd learned to survive on scraps of human kindness, all the fierce love of a father who'd never stopped believing his son would come home. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want to build a life with you. Yes, I want us to be Noah's family together. Elena's answering smile was radiant, transforming her entire face with joy that seemed to light the room from within. Really? You're sure? Because once I start planning this wedding, there's no backing out. I may be new to this family thing, but I take my commitments very seriously. Daniel laughed, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine in a way that surprised him. I'm sure. I'm terrified and overwhelmed and not entirely convinced I deserve this kind of happiness, but I'm sure. 3 months later, Daniel stood in the community center that Elena had built in Brooklyn, the same building where he'd first learned what it meant to transform contaminated ground into something that could sustain life. The space had been decorated simply but elegantly with flowers from the community garden that had been planted on land he'd helped to clean. The wedding guests were an eclectic mix that would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier. Elena's corporate colleagues sat next to residents from the neighborhoods where Daniel worked, former homeless shelter volunteers next to society figures, foster children who'd aged out of the system next to board members of major corporations. It was a gathering that represented not just the coming together of two lives, but the breaking down of barriers between worlds that too often existed in isolation from each other. Noah served as ring-bearer, his small chest puffed out with importance as he carried the simple bands that Daniel and Elena had chosen together. The rings were beautiful, but not ostentatious white gold, inscribed with words that only the three of them would understand, from broken to whole. Elena walked down the aisle unescorted, having insisted that she was giving herself to Daniel, rather than being transferred from one protector to another. She wore a simple white dress that emphasized her natural beauty, rather than making grand statements about wealth or status. But it was her face that took Daniel's breath away, radiant with joy, soft with love, and fixed on him with the kind of absolute certainty that made him believe in forever. The ceremony itself was brief, focused on promises they were making, not just to each other, but to Noah, who stood between them as they exchanged vows. When Daniel spoke of loving Elena in plenty and in want, in sickness and in health, his voice carried the weight of someone who'd experienced the full spectrum of human fortune. When Elena promised to love and honor him for better and for worse, she looked directly into his eyes with the fierce devotion of someone who'd chosen to love, not despite his flaws, but because of the way he'd survived them. But the moment that brought tears to every eye in the room came when Noah stepped forward carrying a small wrapped package that he presented to Elena with 8-year-old solemnity. "This is for you," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent space. "Because you love my daddy, and you love me, and that makes you family." Elena unwrapped the package with trembling fingers, revealing a small, framed drawing, executed in careful crayon strokes. It showed 3 figures standing in front of a house, a man, a woman, and a small boy with "Our Family" written across the top in Noah's painstaking handwriting. Below the figures, in smaller letters, he'd added, "Love never ends." Elena's tears fell freely as she knelt to hug Noah, whispering words of gratitude and love that only he could hear. Daniel watched his wife and his son embracing these 2 people who'd somehow found their way into his life and transformed his understanding of what family could mean. The reception was held in the same space with tables laden with food prepared by volunteers from the neighborhoods where Daniel worked. Children from the community center played between the tables while their parents shared stories about how the cleanup projects had changed their lives. Elena's colleagues from Carter Industries mingled with social workers and former convicts, teachers, and construction workers, creating the kind of diverse celebration that reflected the unconventional family that was being born. As the evening wound down, Daniel found himself standing at the edge of the dance floor, watching Elena waltz with Noah to a slow song that had been one of Sarah's favorites. His son's small hand was placed carefully on Elena's waist, his face serious with concentration as he tried to remember the steps she'd taught him earlier. "She's good with him," a voice said beside him. Daniel turned to find Marcus Williams, his friend from the streets, dressed in a suit that Elena had insisted on buying for the occasion. Marcus had been one of Daniel's first hires when he'd expanded the environmental team, his years of construction experience proving invaluable on the remediation projects. "She loves him," Daniel replied, watching as Elena spun Noah in a careful circle that made the boy giggle with delight. "I never expected that part. I hoped she'd accept him, tolerate him maybe. But she genuinely loves him like he's her own." "That's because she sees what you see," Marcus said. "That kid's special. Got his father's heart and his mother's wisdom. She'd be crazy not to love him." Daniel nodded, thinking about Sarah and the way she would have felt about this moment. He'd worried for months about whether loving Elena was somehow a betrayal of his first wife's memory, whether building a new family dishonored the one they'd shared. But watching Elena dance with Noah, seeing the joy on both their faces, he knew Sarah would have been the first person to celebrate this second chance at happiness. The song ended, and Elena walked Noah back toward Daniel, both of them slightly breathless from their dance. Noah immediately claimed his father's hand, while Elena slipped her arm through Daniel's other elbow, the three of them standing together as the last of the guests began to say their goodbyes. "So what happens now?" Elena asked, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion that comes after intense emotional experiences. "Now we go home," Daniel replied, the word carrying weight it had never held before. Home wasn't just a place anymore. It was wherever the three of them were together. "Can we stop for ice cream on the way?" Noah asked, looking up at his parents with hopeful eyes. Elena and Daniel exchanged glances over his head, one of those wordless communications that couples develop over time. "I think ice cream sounds perfect," Elena said, "but only if you promise to brush your teeth extra well before bed." As they left the community center together, Daniel couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months ago, he'd been a broken man, sleeping in doorways, carrying his son's drawing like a talisman against despair. Elena had been a lonely CEO surrounded by wealth, but starved for genuine human connection. Now they walked through the Brooklyn streets as a family, Noah skipping between them, while chattering about wedding cake and dancing, and whether they could get a dog now that they were officially married. The transformation seemed impossible, like something from a fairy tale rather than real life. But as Elena's hand found his in the darkness, as Noah's laughter echoed off the buildings around them, Daniel realized that the most profound changes often began with the smallest gestures. A coat given to a stranger in the cold. A moment of recognition between two damaged souls. The choice to believe that kindness mattered, that love was possible, that broken things could be made whole again. Their apartment, their home, was filled with wedding gifts and the detritus of celebration, but also with something more precious, the sense that they belonged together, that the family they'd created was strong enough to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. As they settled Noah into his bed, Elena read him a story, while Daniel listened from the doorway, marveling at how naturally she'd stepped into the role of mother. When Noah finally drifted off to sleep, they stood together in the doorway of his room, watching the rise and fall of his small chest in the dim light from the hallway. "Thank you," Daniel whispered, his arm around Elena's waist. "For what?" "For seeing something worth saving in a homeless man at a bus stop. For believing I deserved a second chance when I'd stopped believing it myself. For loving Noah like he's your own child." Elena turned in his arms, her face tilted up toward his in the darkness. "Thank you for giving me your coat when you had every reason to keep it for yourself. For showing me what real kindness looks like. For letting me be part of your family when I'd forgotten what family even meant." They moved to their bedroom now officially and permanently. And as Elena changed out of her wedding dress, Daniel thought about all the nights he'd spent alone on the streets, wondering if he'd ever feel human again. The answer was here in this moment, in the woman who was now his wife, and the child who was sleeping safely down the hall. "I love you," Daniel said, as Elena joined him in bed, her head finding its natural place on his shoulder. "I love you too," she replied, her voice already drowsy with contentment. "Both of you, my boys." As sleep began to claim them, Daniel thought about Noah's drawing from the wedding, about the words, "Love never ends," written in a child's careful handwriting. Sarah's love for him hadn't ended with her death. It had simply transformed, making space for new love to grow. His love for Noah had survived homelessness and separation and legal battles. and the love he'd found with Elena felt strong enough to last for whatever time they had left in the world. Outside their window, the city continued its relentless pace, millions of people pursuing their own dreams of connection and meaning. Somewhere in those streets, other broken souls were searching for redemption, for second chances, for the kind of miraculous transformation that seemed impossible until it happened. Daniel pulled Elena closer and closed his eyes, carrying with him the image of Noah's joyful face as he danced with his new mother, the sound of Elena's laughter as she'd promised to love them both forever, and the profound peace that came from finally understanding that he was worthy of love after all. In the morning, they would wake up as a family. They would make breakfast together, argue gently about schedules and responsibilities, navigate the beautiful chaos of building a life together. Noah would ask a million questions about everything from dinosaurs to airplanes, to whether love really could last forever. Elena would kiss them both goodbye as she headed to the office, already planning ways to expand their environmental programs into new communities. And Daniel would carry with him the knowledge that sometimes the most profound changes began with the smallest acts of kindness, that love could bloom in the most unlikely places, and that even the most broken hearts could learn to beat whole again. The snow that had brought them together that night at the bus stop was long gone, replaced by the first warm promises of spring. But the love that had begun with a shared jacket and a stranger's kindness would endure through all the seasons to come, a living testament to the power of hope and the radical possibility of redemption. They were home.